Good afternoon. Wow, I feel like I'm outside. The bright light is like sunshine. Well, thank you all for coming. Thank you for not watching the Olympics, not going to the beach, and for hopefully seeing the exhibition that's on view. I'm Stephanie Schrader, and I'm curator of drawings here at the Getty. And I'm also the moderator for today's event, Frozen in Time, The Politics of 17th Century Dutch Landscapes. I would like to first acknowledge that the land the Getty inhabits today was once known as Tovangar, the home of the Gabrielino Tongva people. We show our respects to the Gabrielino Tongva people as well as all First People, past, present, future, and honor their labor as original caretakers of this land. Getty commits to building relationships with the Gabrielino Tongva community, and we invite you to acknowledge the history of this land and join us for caring for it. Today's program complements the current exhibition that I hope some of you have been able to see, On Thin Ice, Dutch Depictions of Extreme Weather, located in the West Pavilion through September 1st. The exhibition galleries will be open today until 5:30, so if you haven't been able to see the show or you're inspired to see new aspects of the exhibition, you can see it today until 5:30. And as curator of this exhibition and moderator, I want to briefly outline for you some relevant facts. As many of you might know, early modern Europe experienced widespread regional cooling that historians now identify as the Little Ice Age. The changes in wind patterns and ocean currents greatly impacted the Netherlands, and snow fell more abundantly. A staggering fact that one must consider regarding the impact of lower temperatures in the 1600s is how the Dutch reclaimed land from the sea and inland lakes to increase the size of their country by 53%. Not only did the Dutch create half of their land, a country that is the size of West Virginia, but they also connected people and goods, building over 400 miles of canals. As bitter cold temperatures froze waterways, rivers, and seaports, the Dutch came up with new ways to transport people and products. Dutch artwork made in the Little Ice Age features this technological ingenuity and resilience. Artists like Hendrik Averkamp, whose work you see on the screen, highlighted adaptation in their winter landscapes that depict traversal from one place to another on ice skates, ice carts, and ice yachts. This sense of movement was often met with impediments as people slip and boats sink. These hardships appear alongside newly invented activities, games of golf, a mixture between golf and croquet, ice fishing, and makeshift taverns serving warm drinks. No detail was too small for Dutch artists to consider. The muffs and face masks worn by wealthy women to keep warm, the catch carried by fishermen and hunters, the blustery winds that made clouds and flags billow, and the lack of undergarments exposed when people tumbled. These compelling details made winter landscapes all the more desirable for Dutch citizens to purchase and to hang in their homes for contemplation. Like 17th century Dutch landscapes remind us, responding to climate change effectively is difficult. Yet even when we flail and fall, like the ice skater you see here from an illustrated book in 1669, we too must have the courage not to give up. Today's three speakers will draw upon artworks in my exhibition to touch upon important themes in their own research. These include politics and Dutch identity, as depicted by Averkamp, land reclamation and its erasure in 17th century Dutch visual culture, and the quotidian labors of the watery muck. Before introducing the speakers, I have a few housekeeping notes I want to share with you. For those here in the auditorium, please take a moment to silence your mobile devices. And for online attendees, and I hear 400 people signed up, so you guys are amidst many others in virtual lands, closed captioning has been enabled. To access live captioning, click the CC icon on the Zoom menu bar at the bottom of the screen while you're home. And time permitting, definitely we'll have time for questions, and we'll sit up here and take audience questions and Zoom questions, and then I have a couple questions of my own if you don't feel like asking them yourself. So it is now my honor to introduce our three speakers, and I'm going to introduce them now in order of their talks, and they'll come up one after the other. Our first speaker today is Isabella Lloris Chavez, and she is the Associate Curator of European Paintings at the Fine Arts Museum of San Francisco, where she oversees the collection's Dutch and Flemish paintings. She completed her PhD at Columbia University in 2022 with a dissertation about plaster cast and 17th century Dutch paintings. In 2013, she created a small exhibition at the Metropolitan Museum of Art entitled Dutch and French Genre Drawings from the Robert Lehman Collection, and she was born in Colombia and raised here in Los Angeles. Isabella has also previously worked at the Getty and at LACMA. Our second speaker is Alec Aldridge, and he is the Kress Institutional Fellow at Leiden University and a PhD candidate in the history of art and architecture at the University of California at Santa Barbara. His dissertation, quote, Common Ground, Landscape, and the Mediation of Technology in the Dutch Republic, end quote, examines the entanglement of artistic and technological creativity in the 17th century through the representation of proto-industrial architecture and engineering projects in Dutch landscape images. In tandem with his academic career, Alec has also held numerous curatorial positions in museums across the country, including the Metropolitan Museum of Art, the National Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C., and most recently in my beloved department at the Getty. And Sarah Malloy is a specialist in early modern Northern European art with a focus on environmental and colonial histories. Her dissertation examines depictions of wetlands in 17th century Dutch art. Previously, Malloy held internships and positions at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, the Harvard Art Museums, and the Frick Collection. She holds a BA in Science, Technology, and Cultural Studies from Georgia Institute of Technology, an MA in Design History from Parsons, the New School of Design, and an MA in Art History from New York University Institute of the Arts. She is currently the Annette and Oscar de la Renta Assistant Curator of Drawings and Prints at the Morgan Library Museum in New York. And I hope you will all find their work as energizing and exciting as I do. And please welcome all three speakers.
Well, thank you very much to you all for being here with us today. Thank you to Stephanie for this amazing invitation. It's so exciting to be in LA and to be here to visit the exhibition, to share the podium with my fellow speakers, Sarah and Alec. Thanks for being here today from much further away than I have come today. The ability to observe, to see clearly, penetratingly, attentively, often refers to visual apprehension, to perception of the visible. But to observe can also mean to notice and to make sense of the intangible. The work of Hendrik Averkamp, the focus of our symposium, perfectly encapsulates this dual sense of observation. His landscapes capture the world he studied, literally reflecting contemporary life upon the mirror-like surface of ice. Averkamp exercises powers of observation to chronicle and understand both the literal and the political climate of his time. In ambitious format, Averkamp's winter scene on a frozen canal teems with anecdotes about taking to the ice on a winter's day. Men and women lace up their skates. Fishermen set off to work. Friends play kolf, literally a sort of golf on the ice. Others ride sleds. One guy has taken a particularly nasty tumble, drawing blood. What Averkamp shows us is not precise documentation of a single day, but an inventive amalgamation of sights that he could take in during the long and extreme winters he experienced. At the same time, he anchors the landscape in a specific historical time and location through the seemingly nondescript inclusion of flags. The Dutch flag in Averkamp's ice skating scenes suggests that his figures share not only their capacity for merriment, despite the harsh conditions, but also their affiliation with a distinct political entity. By the time Averkamp began crafting images of his native land, citizens of the Dutch Republic had experienced several tumultuous decades of war, displacement, and political negotiation. In the mid-1560s, the northern provinces of the Netherlands had initiated a revolt against Spain, which held dominion over the region. The 1608 winter landscape, one of Averkamp's earliest dated paintings, coincides almost precisely with the beginning of the so-called 12 Years' Truce, the ceasefire agreement reached between the united northern Netherlandish provinces and the Spanish king, Philip III. After more than 40 years of warfare that led to the political division of the Low Countries, the newly created Dutch Republic entered a brief period of peace between 1609 and 1621. Baptized in Amsterdam in 1585, Averkamp came of age in a place deeply affected by the events of the Dutch Revolt, which had instigated waves of migration away from the Spanish-dominated southern provinces, producing a more diverse society. Averkamp's paintings and watercolors capture one broad conception of a community in a politically uncertain moment, a profusion of activities and temperaments represented as a unified whole despite individual differences. The Dutch tricolor, sprinkled throughout his ice skating scenes, provides another indication of the potential bond among his figures. This flag, which flew during the early battles in the revolt against Spain, constitutes more than an anecdotal touch. The tricolor flag connects Averkamp's depictions of quotidian existence to rhetoric about the fatherland that celebrated self-governance and collective identity in the first few decades of the Dutch Republic. The paintings, to say nothing of the substantial extant studies and preparatory drawings, are a testament to Averkamp's keen eye for characteristics that individualize his figures' attitudes, costumes, accessories, and behaviors. As a result, he is sometimes cast in the role of the dispassionate observer, particularly in light of his disability. Known as de Stomme van Kampen, or the mute from Kampen, Averkamp was a person with a speech disability and was almost certainly hard of hearing. When we take seriously the presence of the tricolor flags in his ice skating landscapes, we also recognize a person distinctly engaged with the political issues that preoccupied Dutch citizens at the time. Averkamp pictures a variety of individuals occupied with highly specific tasks, both for labor and leisure, offering an appealing vision of life in the Dutch Republic, especially for newcomers to the region. In his lifetime, the Dutch Republic saw a massive influx of immigrants, particularly from the southern Netherlands. Although cities had the most dramatic increases in population, villages and small towns also swelled with people fleeing strict and difficult living conditions under Spanish rule in the southern provinces. In many towns in the northern province of Holland, families who had not been displaced had nevertheless endured sieges and occupations by Spanish soldiers, the same perpetrators featured in the stories of violence and disruption that migrants and native Hollanders continued to tell in the early 17th century. In the northern provinces, people could relate to each other's stories of hardship, seeking a better life, whether their town was their birthplace or their adopted home. While in the process of social integration and recuperation, these communities faced some of the harshest climate conditions of the era. Averkamp's production of ice skating scenes is, in this sense, a kind of historical work, chronicling Dutch citizens' responses to the difficult winters of what we now call the Little Ice Age. Averkamp's hometown of Kampen, in particular, had a history of courting immigrants, competing with larger towns for skilled workers, and in 1592 offered free citizenship to newcomers. Averkamp and his family must have witnessed these solicited waves of migration while they lived in Kampen. The hefty and conspicuously diverse group of people that takes to the ice in these landscapes is a microcosm of the young republic's dynamic society, deeply affected by changes in climate and population alike. In reality, the Dutch Republic's immigrant population struggled with integration as they settled into their new residences. In Averkamp's ice skating scenes, tensions between Southern immigrants and Northern Netherlanders are readily elided, although he does include certain markers of regional identity. In the LACMA painting, he carefully describes the cloak or hauk from the northern province of Holland worn by a woman at left, as well as the readily identifiable Flemish or Southern Netherlandish hauk of the group of women at right. This painting also includes a depiction of Romani women, both with dark brown skin and babies in wraps across their backs. Although Romani communities had used the land near Kampen since the 15th century, they were mistrusted and persecuted throughout the early modern period. Furthermore, in the middle ground, a black page accompanies an affluent group, reminding us that already around 1620, the Dutch trading companies had entered into the transatlantic slave trade. Slavery was illegal within the Republic, but wealthy Dutch families could employ black servants transported from the Dutch colonies in Asia and the Americas. The inequities that very much existed in Averkamp's society are transformed in his idealized compositions, which picture men, women, and children as a social and political unit. Though these paintings do not feature overt political allegories of the sort commonly found in printed broadsheets circulating during the early decades of the Dutch Revolt, the tricolor that would become the national flag is ubiquitous. It is an exceptional and unusual sight within the corpus of early Dutch landscape paintings, yet seemingly natural in Averkamp's paintings in watercolors, appearing quietly in the background. Though the concept of nationalism most familiar to us today is a phenomenon that originated in the 19th century, a form of national consciousness did emerge around the stories of the revolt and its aftermath in the early Dutch Republic. Indeed, the idea of sovereignty that took shape in this period arose from the culture of the revolt and secession, with the tricolor flag being one of the most recognizable symbols of the revolt. The watershed moment for the use of the tricolor came during the capture of Brill in April 1572 by a group of privateers known as the Sea Beggars sailing under the flag of William of Orange. The three livery colors of the House of Orange, blue, white, and orange, were subsequently worn by soldiers at the Siege of Leiden in 1574, and the flag with horizontal stripes in the same colors appeared on the masts of Dutch ships fighting the Spanish on the open seas in the late 1570s. Although the provinces each had their own flags, the use of William of Orange's livery colors was a visual declaration of resistance and solidarity with the causes championed by the Prince of Orange and the rebellion. A red stripe soon began to replace the orange band at the top of the flag, possibly as a strategy to distance the Republic from the aristocratic House of Orange in favor of the semi-democratic governing body called the Dutch Estates General, whose flag was red with a gold lion. The red stripe became the norm by around 1660. Averkamp's paintings from the first 2 decades of the 17th century consistently show the flag flying above towns, enjoying the freedom from tyranny and chaos that the revolt, at least in part, had won. Even after his death in 1584, the Prince of Orange was characterized as an inspirational leader, largely through the propaganda efforts of writers, lawyers, and statesmen loyal to him. The tricolor, inspired by his livery, was an explicit visual symbol of Orange's role in the revolt, as representations of Orange became embedded into the popular culture of the new republic. By the time the tricolor flag came into official use, its associations with the revolt had been firmly cemented within a larger project of mythologizing William of Orange. In Averkamp's landscapes, the flag celebrates the fatherland, secured partly under Orange's leadership. In most of Averkamp's ice skating landscapes, the flag proves to be the salient and literal banner under which the viewer understands the scene as consciously Dutch. The primary audience for his conception of a prosperous and unified society consisted of individuals who had experienced the revolt and its consequences. Averkamp spent most of his life in Kampen, and even the collectors in Amsterdam who bought his work often had ties to Kampen or to less urban parts of the Republic. There were no prospects of an international career for Averkamp, making it unlikely that he conceived of his flags as an ambassadorial strategy to export images of Dutchness beyond the northern provinces. Rather, it seems that he sought to convey his allegiance to the Republic during a time of temporary peace through its newly forged symbols. During the 12 Years' Truce, when the future sovereignty of the Dutch Republic seemed more attainable, Averkamp imagined its citizens united not only on a basic human level through labor and leisure, but also through the shared political experience represented by the tricolor. A closer look at these semantically charged motifs of Averkamp's seemingly straightforward and charming paintings reveals an artist keen on envisioning political and cultural unity in his native republic. Averkamp's ice skating scenes are more embedded in the Dutch political situation of the early 17th century than they initially appear to be. From the figures to the representation of the harsh climate to the features of the landscape, Averkamp clearly knew how to work naar het leven, from life, as advocated by 17th century art theorists and practitioners. Moreover, in adopting the tricolor flag, Averkamp was at the vanguard among Dutch painters, conscious of the era's political conditions and capably translating that political awareness into what we now recognize as timelessly Dutch images. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for that great talk. And thanks to Stephanie for inviting me. And thanks to Public Programs for a seamless experience, having a great time. Oh, okay, yes. All right. Hendrik Averkamp's monogrammed and richly colored drawing lends a pleasant air to a mucky task. In the foreground, a man trawls a massive net through a drainage ditch, probably in pursuit of slippery eels, as his son and a small dog stand impassively beside him. At right, cows graze or lap at water, while another calmly permits a woman to collect milk. This seemingly rural scene is actually near a Dutch town, as a covered wagon at left trundles toward a church steeple, peeking over a stand of trees. Many of the details I have just described are rendered with a rainbow palette of watercolors. The male figures in red and blue, the cows' various tones and patterns of warm brown, and the water and land built up in layers of blue and green watercolor, accented with rapid flicks of the brush. One motif, however, did not receive equally careful attention and appears only as traces of graphite in the right half of the sheet. It appears to be a drainage mill, its faint lines blending into the landscape and the blank of the sheet above the horizon line. An arc at the base of the mill suggests a paddle wheel used to push stagnant water into the surrounding ditches. Why did Averkamp include the drainage mill? Why did he abandon it? And what does that say about the representation of land reclamation in the 17th century? I argue here that the erasure of the mill is indicative of a growing rift between existing visual models and new forms of proto-professional agency on the part of surveyors and engineers. After exploring the theme of land reclamation in the context of Averkamp's oeuvre, I will then compare it to images related to or by surveyors and engineers. These latter individuals increasingly argued for the expert nature of their practice, and I think the success of their visual arguments can be measured against the general reluctance of artists to represent land reclamation. Now, it should be noted that windmills, of course, are a stock feature of Dutch landscape drawings, prints, and paintings. Amateur artists such as the lawyer Jan de Bisschop, for instance, produce drawings as a hobby, as in the drawing of a windmill in the top left corner. Rembrandt van Rijn, the son of a miller, also committed the motif to the etching plate, as in the center example. A windmill is the primary motif of what is probably Jacob van Ruisdael's most famous painting. By turns approachable and heroic, the windmill was a versatile and beloved subject of Dutch art. These images, however, generally represent mills that were used primarily for processing goods, such as grains, oils, and even leather. They were not necessarily drainage mills, which are vanishingly rare in Dutch art. While the difference may seem primarily an academic one, I think it is also a matter of basic significance and intentionality. Drainage mills, unlike other windmills, were necessary tools of land reclamation and possess an entirely different relationship to the environment. The Notarial Archive suggests that the drainage windmill was invented by 1408 in the environs of Alkmaar in North Holland. In the 17th century, these mills revolutionized the ability of the Dutch to drain large lakes in North Holland, indicated in green in the map. These reclaimed lakes were called polders, or areas of land surrounded by embankments called dikes. By placing drainage mills in rows, as seen in the top image, one could increase the height to which water would be raised into canals surrounding the polder, or, as seen just below, the rate of water removal. This permitted reclamation of lakes of greater depth and volume than ever before. Unsurprisingly, land reclamation was an incredibly expensive, multi-year procedure that greatly transformed huge amounts of land. Unlike windmills used for milling goods, drainage mills existed within a greater ecological frame that was difficult to reduce to a single motif. For now, keep in mind the Beemster and the Haarlemmermeer polders. Averkamp demonstrates some of the complexity of water management in a second drawing in the Rijksmuseum. In this highly finished watercolor, a fisherman draws a net from a drainage ditch in front of a drainage mill at left, in mirror image, incidentally, to the drawing that opened this talk. But he also added a sluice gate to the Rijksmuseum drawing. The latter device was another important feature of water management, as it prevented flooding from outside the polder, while also permitting draining of interior water depending on relative water levels. Drainage mills were thus part of a larger system that extended well beyond its immediate footprint. And incidentally, a very similar fisherman would appear in a drawing you can see in the exhibition, so definitely check that out. And this study on the right suggests that Averkamp executed individual studies that he then deployed in more fully realized landscape drawings. A second Rijksmuseum drawing further showcases how Averkamp tended to create new visual permutations from a limited set of motifs. The sheet at the bottom left basically reorganizes many of the elements we encountered earlier, including the fisherman, his son, the dog, cows, and covered wagon. But in reordering these elements, Averkamp highlights, in this instance, the unique polder ecology brought about by water management. In the Rijksmuseum drawing, the fisherman attempts to grip a writhing eel caught in his net. Eels, in fact, regularly migrated from saltwater environments to the fresh water of Holland's lakes, and they adapted to the transformation of these lakes into ditches in the polder landscape. We know at this stage that Averkamp recycled motifs, like many Dutch artists of his age, but where did they originate? To my mind, the constellation of motifs found in these drawings, fishermen, drainage mills, sluice gates, and eels, are actually somewhat pedantic, if I may say so, in their explication of the polder landscape. It is therefore no accident that they are probably inspired by an etching by Claes Visser, destined for the deluxe informational format of the printed wall map. In the earlier etching at right, the Amsterdam printmaker condenses Averkamp's motifs into a diminutive picture space. In the foreground, a fisherman hauls an enormous catch of eels, onto the banks of a drainage channel. The mill at left paddles water furiously toward a partially obscured sluice gate. The Dutch inscription notes, quote, "The watermill bailing out water and also the manner of fishing in Holland." As Averkamp does in his drawings, the print similarly describes water management and the unique ecology it produces. In the opening Averkamp drawing, if you will, the artist attempted to arrive at a new formula for the polder landscape, but never moved far beyond Visser's highly choreographed vocabulary. One simple reason is that polder imagery was just not a priority for Averkamp, who of course focused heavily on winter scenes, as we just saw in the previous talk. But we have also noted a lack of visual interest in polder mills in the larger Dutch landscape tradition as well. I therefore want to now think about this erasure more broadly. One potential reason for the general situation I have just described is a fundamental mismatch. A mismatch between the received visual models for representing water management, as in the Visser etching, and the increasing prestige of the actual practices involved in land reclamation. Take, for instance, the Visser image, in which two diagonals in the handle of the fisherman's net and the sails of the polder mill visually aligned their respective labors. I am sorry to say that in the 17th century, a fisherman was not considered a highly skilled laborer. But by contrast, as I will show in a moment, surveyors and engineers greatly recharacterized the relationship of their labor to land reclamation over the course of the century. Let's take the surveyor first. Surveying was necessary to calculate the area of water to be reclaimed. This unique hand-colored and gilded impression of an etching was initially produced after the formation of a company to drain the Beemster Lake in 1607, just 1 year before Visser's print. But we know it was colored and placed in a customized atlas in the 1670s, confirming the great esteem that land reclamation held even some 60 years later. The figure of the surveyor in an exceptional plum and saffron-colored outfit gazes intently through his surveying instrument in such a way that invites us to consider his intellectual insight. The print actively shapes the surveyor's prestige through involvement in the process of land reclamation. It reframes his involvement as, I dare say, distinct from the untutored fisherman. The inscription states that the application of the, quote, exact surveyor's art has resulted in the representation of the Beemster Lake's current state. To an extent, this is an elevation of practice that is a common platitude seen in maps, but some context is helpful here. The surveyor Jan Petersen Douw was involved in determining the area of the Beemster Lake. He was singularly concerned with elevating the practice of surveying, which traditionally was a poorly regulated trade based in practical know-how rather than theoretical knowledge. A portrait print of Douw at right shows him in the costume of a gentleman, while the inscription suggests, very modestly, I will add, that his mastery of geometry makes him the very reincarnation of Pythagoras and Euclid. He likewise published several tracts about the practice of surveying. One of these manuals, on the use of geometrical instruments, features illustrations that demonstrate the practical application of the mathematical insights described in the text itself. One of these, related to a chapter about measuring the area of a river, bears a strong formal correspondence to the Beemster map. In both instances, figures theatrically display, in fine attire, the practice of taking numerous measurements to calculate the area of a body of water through trigonometric calculations. Measuring the area of the Beemster Lake was thus a real-world application of scenarios described in the text, a prestigious opportunity to demonstrate Douw's ability. The figure of the Beemster map likewise uses a variant of Douw's invention, the so-called Holland circle, that features a movable sight to easily make angular measurements. Douw notably demonstrated the use of this device at the Beemster as well. Given the context of the map's production, surveying is billed as an innovative, intellectual, and crucial component of land reclamation. The intently gazing surveyor thus asks us to not only see present-day water, but to imagine future land as well. In this particular impression, imaginative investment in the material transformation of the body of water was quite literal. Two sailboats in the lake in this impression are not part of the original etched composition. Instead, they were cut out of other etchings, then pasted onto the receiving sheet and hand-colored to disguise their addition to the composition. As we have seen, land reclamation was an opportunity to perform social aspirations, and this is also true for the engineer, as seen in the portrait print of Jan Adriaensen Leyvater. Civil engineering, as we understand it today, of course, did not exist in the 17th century. Instead, it was considered a component of military engineering, or under the umbrella of the jack-of-all-trades building master or carpenter. Within this fluid context, Leyvater attempted to stabilize the nature of his own work, which spanned all of these categories. He's best remembered for his Haarlemmermeer book, a proposal to drain the largest lake in Holland to the southwest of Amsterdam, and this is where Schiphol Airport is now. Although this lake would not be drained until the 19th century, the site presented an opportunity for self-promotion. Leyvater's book is mentioned in the inscription of his portrait print, published only 2 years after the tract. The inscription notably describes Leyvater as someone whose, quote, soul works all the time and never tires, a workaholic. This description, in effect, though, endows Leyvater with the properties of a machine, or, I dare say, a drainage mill. As will become clear, however, this was not the tireless labor of Averkamp's fishermen. The earliest manuscript map related to his Haarlemmermeer proposal bears a date of 1629, around the time Averkamp presumably executed his drawing. There's not time to discuss every detail, but a few areas deserve special mention. The drainage mill, represented in delicate pen cross-hatching, bears the date of the map's execution, which strongly identifies Leyvater's authorial presence in the milling technology itself. He calls a water wheel schematic a contrafactum, a terminology claiming a kind of objectivity, endowing his image with an almost scientific authority. A final detail in the lower margin demonstrates Leyvater's social pretensions. In willowy script, and sorry for not blowing this up, it's really hard to see anyway, he writes, quote, "I have hereby made a small pamphlet in honor of all Liefhebbers who would like to read more about this and speculate therein." Liefhebbers, or elite amateurs, were non-professional upper-class lovers of various knowledge-based fields, which also significantly included art. Evidently, one could be a lover of land reclamation, too. Leyvater shaped his identity with respect to future projects, but likewise attempted to cement his existing legacy in similar terms. Elite aesthetic practices were central to his self-promotion. An unusual drawing dated to 1632 memorializes his involvement in the reclamation of the Beemster, where Douw had also applied his expertise. Set between two stone buildings, a schematic view of a drainage mill, with its internal mill wheel visible, towers over everything else. It bears a typological resemblance to 16th century theaters of machines, which were collected by wealthy 17th century Dutch bibliophiles. Such a visual illusion therefore places Leyvater's practice within a prestigious lineage. Two textual elements provide crucial context for this drawing. The first is a quote from the Roman poet Horace, quote, "Nothing is happy in every respect," derived from a poem about odium, or rural leisure away from the artificial concerns of the city. The second indicates the recipient of the drawing, the Beemster dijkreef Dirk van Os, a wealthy and prominent figure who is responsible for supervising water management of the reclaimed Beemster. His portrait would later be painted by none other than Rembrandt. The theme of otium and the practice of gifting drawings were together strongly associated with the production and circulation of Dutch landscape drawings for Liefhebbers. In adopting these classicizing codes and social practices, Leyvater insisted that his engineering acumen be considered within the context of elite aesthetic delectation. Leyvater's drawing would have been an appropriate gift for Van Os, both by virtue of his water management role and his social station. Via engineering, then, we have really come full circle back to landscape drawing and Averkamp's vanishing mill, as the artist's own drawing would have circulated within a similar milieu. But first, what did land reclamation mean? Was it physical toil, a site of applied ingenuity, or an elite social practice? Clearly, it could actually be any one of these things, depending on the context. While much of this talk has been concerned with images as a site of self-characterization, I think that it is also significant to consider this from the standpoint of reception. The ability to target different audiences by dressing up land reclamation and water management in various guises may not be entirely divorced from the success of these practices in the early modern period. For map enthusiasts, perhaps it was enough to compare the drainage mill to the sympathetic figure of the fisherman, as in the Fisher print. For potential investors, on the other hand, it was necessary to legitimize the labor of land reclamation through its innovative practices. In the case of Levater, land reclamation was turned into an aesthetic mandate for a potential patron. In all of these instances, providing an appealing vision that addressed itself to various core values and sensibilities was as important as the technology itself, and there may be lessons here for us today. In conclusion, Averkamp's career coincided with the proliferation of new attitudes around the expertise of water management that were equal parts visual and creative. One might assume such rich images from the fields of surveying and engineering could be an artistic resource, as Fisher's map had been, but it may be that they had the opposite effect. Indeed, while Averkamp demonstrated an interest in the possible configurations of the polder landscape, he, like many other Dutch artists, did not often represent it. In a manner of speaking, they left it to the experts. Thank you.
Hello, good afternoon. I echo the previous sentiments of my panelists, so a huge thanks to the Getty community, especially to Dr. Stephanie Schrader for kindly inviting me to join this distinguished panel, for her generous comments and suggestions on this paper, and for curating the wonderful exhibition on thin ice. As Stephanie's beautiful exhibition makes clear, the bone-chilling cold of the Little Ice Age inspired artworks by numerous 17th century Dutch artists, particularly the drawings and paintings of Hendrik Averkamp. He is celebrated for his depictions of wintertime frivolity, like this painting in the exhibition. We see finely dressed couples cavorting on ice, alongside less socioeconomically advantaged individuals. In this painting, there seems to be a marked contrast between the largely well-to-do folks more on the right, near the city walls, and the laboring classes on left, near dilapidated buildings found across the river. While these two places would normally be separated by flowing waters, they are here united by ice. And as my fellow panelist, Isabella Loris Chavez, beautifully pointed out, Averkamp's paintings of wintertime scenes often blend social hierarchies to present an aspirational idea of unity in the fledgling Dutch Republic. But today, I want to consider another aspect of such unity, or perhaps disunity, in Averkamp's oeuvre, through looking closely at this watercolor drawing. Here, the artist shows us not merriment on ice, but rather quotidian labors in the watery muck. He shows us the life of those people across the river and what they do after the big seasonal thaw. Averkamp presents to us the moment, as poet E.E. Cummings wrote, quote, "In just spring, when the world is mud luscious, when the world is puddle wonderful." In other words, Averkamp gives us a wetland, the de facto environment that encompassed much of the Netherlands when wintertime was not stilling the waters. What Averkamp's wetland shows us is, in many ways, not at all unique. Soft, low-lying terrain appears in many artworks of the period, as you can see here, though I want to say it's rarely remarked upon, perhaps because wetlands are, for the people who live with them, very familiar. But Averkamp's drawing reminds us that there is power and importance in declaring or seeing those parts of life that are so familiar they somehow become invisible. The training of Dutch artists of this period, which was dictated by the influential Carl van Mander, who's pictured here, emphasized that marshlands were actually a really important part of the landscape. And declaring the Dutch landscape worthy of art, Van Mander and other artists are making a radical claim. The swampy low country landscape had for centuries, by other European societies like the ancient Romans, been denigrated as an uninhabitable place void of culture. Now, clearly, that is not true. And Averkamp's work, I would say, is inescapably devoted to wetlands, whether frozen or thawed, and their inhabitants. And his depictions were perhaps inspired by the town where he lived and worked, a place called Kampen, which I show you here on a modern-day map of the Netherlands. Located at the mouth of the IJssel River, Kampen was, for centuries, a wealthy and bustling trade port, particularly for the lucrative herring trade. When around 1430, parts of the IJssel River silted up, trade suffered, but the city remained a key port. And here I show you a view of the city from around 1575, and it's a view from outside of the town, across the river. We see wagons of laborers and fishermen hauling in large nets along the riverbank. And if you think about it, this view is not unlike the one that Averkamp shows us here. And I can't say that this is a view of outside of Kampen, but this wetland scene is a reminder that water management was always an important part of life in the low-lying area around the town. Now, I want to note that wetlands throughout the Dutch Republic were both naturally occurring and man-made. But what do I mean by naturally occurring and man-made? So, to fully understand, we're going to have to take a journey back into Earth's history. Approximately 10,000 years ago, as enormous glaciers receded globally, they left a swampy terrain. In the geographical area that we think of as the Dutch Republic, many wetlands existed and for millennia nurtured a unique culture that was highly mobile on the water and excelled in fishing. So this drawing is actually a reminder of the long-standing ecology between the wetlands of the Netherlands and its people. So we have to kind of keep that long, deep history in mind. Now, add to that by the Middle Ages, large-scale deforestation caused the Dutch to dig a lot of peat from bogs. Peat is a type of organic matter which, when dried, becomes a fuel source that was used in the 17th century to heat homes, cook food, and support industries like brewing, ceramics, and brickmaking. You know, when we think of those beautiful blue and white ceramics, you had to have peat to make those. And peat was also present during Dutch colonial pursuits, so that's also something important to remember, that peat-fueled empire. Peat diggers were often itinerant or migrant laborers, the very lowest on the socioeconomic ladder. Meanwhile, peatland owners were often wealthier men who lived in metropolitan centers like Amsterdam, away from the remote dig sites that were called peat colonies. So here we have a drawing, which is featured in the exhibition, which is probably a depiction of a peat digger, and you'll note he's in tattered clothes and he's leaning on a shovel or a spade. So in what becomes a vicious cycle, the Little Ice Age drastically increased energy demands, causing ever more digging of peat. Today, peat bogs and wetlands in general remain really important places where carbon is stored, so-called carbon sinks. And contemporary efforts to preserve these wetlands are meant to help stop the release of carbon into the atmosphere, because as we now know, more carbon in the atmosphere hastens our own big thaw of glaciers and ice caps. So when we look at Averkamp's landscape, we must remember the wetland thaw he depicts is very much connected to our current climate. These diagrams, which show the peatlands in brown, give you a sense of just how much of the Netherlands 3,500 years ago on left were comprised of peat, and then how, on the far side, by the 16th century, how much of this peatland had been decimated. And in these diagrams, we see here that the expansive peat digging caused land elevation to fall. So at the top, you see like 1000 BC, and by the time you get to 1500, the land sinks when you start removing peat out of it. So we think of the Netherlands as famously below sea level. Well, it did used to have a little more topography than that. So anyway, when these sunken pits of land where peat was exhumed were abandoned, which often happened, they filled up with rain and groundwater and formed rapidly expanding wetlands that couldn't drain when sudden storms, which blew through during the Little Ice Age, happened, and on occasion Averkamp depicts as here. Now sometimes, as we just heard from Alec very beautifully, when funds were available and the community agreed, abandoned peat colonies were drained and became fertile farmlands called polders. This map of Kampen shows us at the bottom, the very, very bottom where you see sort of that star formation, the beginnings of the Mastenbroek polder, which is an area just across the river from town. Now, peat digging around Kampen took place for centuries, and even Vincent van Gogh took inspiration from the Dutch peat moors, which he painted in 1893, you see here. The site he shows was in a province just adjacent to Kampen. Studying peat moors encouraged him to commit himself to life as a painter and to depict people, which he referred to as peasants. So with this environmental history in mind, we can begin to see how Averkamp's drawing reveals the art of a wetland ecosystem. The pale early morning light shines a soft glow. Under the watchful eye of the early bird, the tide creeps in, bringing oxygenated waters and fish who in the spring months spawn in thick estuary grasses along the shoals. Fishermen know this, and they haul in their first catch of the day, while nearby larger ships called busses likely bring in herring from the North Sea. Behind them, a dike holds the land in place. Averkamp softly blends the sandy shoals into the water, making it difficult to tell where land ends and water begins. Even the whole sheet of paper is a beige tone, akin to the pale sand found on Dutch dunes, this hue coloring the whole view. This drawing, to me, captures not only how Averkamp saw wetlands, but also how the confusion of land with water duplicates the slippery reality that the residents of the Dutch Republic often negotiated. And when I look at this, I think, how often did the artist suddenly find his shoes wet while standing at what he thought was a water's edge? Now, as if to suggest the ever-changing, even perilous condition of the land and its people, Averkamp includes in the far background, beyond the distant borders of a town, what might be a gallows with a hanging body. This is a frequent feature in his rural landscapes, and as we've already seen, Averkamp repeats his motifs. But here, this hanging body speaks to one perspective on the wetlands, which was to be managed and pushed into the social margins. But by making in this drawing the wetland the central focus, Averkamp also allows us to consider how a landscape should or could be marginalized by the very culture it helped form. This is a prescient question for us today. In a moment when human behaviors are actively causing climate change that is hastening a great thaw, how can or do we pick and choose what sorts of environments should be understood as normal or desirable? We also have to ask this question of the people who live in ostensibly marginal environments, as here. Often it was the fishermen who fought against the draining of wetlands, for such actions destroyed the fishing estuaries. These men also lived on meager wages, were understood to occupy a lower rung on the social ladder. In this drawing, we actually see their perspective. Averkamp would have been aware of this hierarchy, as we've heard, and on numerous occasions gives us a closer look at life in the wetlands. In the background here, while well-dressed travelers pass by on horseback, a woman of humble means washes her clothing in the water while her baby sits in a tub. Another child, maybe hers, rolls in the mud behind her. This is perhaps a commentary on the thankless task of laundry. It is never-ending, especially in a muddy wetland world. There's a gentle inevitability to all of it. Just as the waters and the mud and the labor will always come back after the great thaw, so too will the city dwellers recede and separate back to solid ground. We should note a man fishes, his front foot sinks into the soft ground, more indeterminacy. This drawing by Averkamp, also in the exhibition, gives us a close view of the fishermen we often only see at a distance. Bundled up against the spring air's chill, his meager catch reminds us of the difficulty of eking out a living as a fisherman. The white of the paper, both representing land and water, reminds us of the environmental uncertainties he faces. So again, I can't unequivocally identify the location of the scene depicted here. It may well be imaginary, but what is evident, however, is that Averkamp in his own mind knew this place well, because he returned to it in a way, as we see here. Also included in this exhibition is this drawing, which gives a similar view, but only from the opposite side. I want to again thank Stephanie for pointing out that on the back of this is written Haarlemmermeer, which we've also heard Alec talk about. And this was first a peat bog, the Haarlemmermeer, and then it turned into a large lake that then in the 19th century was drained. So this may be what we're seeing here. These two drawings may or may not be the same place, but there are similarities. So the dike, for example, is now on the opposite side of the page, as is the fishing bus. A small fishing boat is moored in the ice where it will remain until the thaw. Though we don't know if Overkamp created these two drawings at the same time, I'd like to think that his return to these two subjects, winter and the wetland thaw, reveals a keen intention. In the Dutch spring, the world once again becomes a place where the water, the land, the long workdays all slide together. From the view of this wetland, the town seems a faraway place, and perhaps only in leisure hours do the well-to-do venture outside city walls. There's no frozen river or canal upon which to find a common ground between the laboring and the dwelling in wetland, and the view of the wetland. In winter, however, a bright orange sunset imparts a sense of joy and ease. The wetland becomes the communal space where all sorts of people, impossibly, walk on the water that so often divides them. And I don't know if Overkamp preferred the thaw to the ice, but maybe for him it was two sides of the same coin. An acknowledgement of the give and take, ebb and flow, the haves and have-nots, the inevitable cyclical nature of an environment that even in the depths of winter was always on the verge of unjust spring, soon to be mud luscious. And as for us today, I think this drawing makes us think about how we can continue, in a way, the work of Overkamp to see, to live with, and to preserve wetlands. Thank you. So I think it's time for Q&A.
There we can see you better. So, do we have any questions from the audience? And if you do have a question, please alert an attendant. Oh, me. I need to speak in the microphone. That's what. Sorry. Is this on? Yes. Can you hear me? So you can hear me without the microphone because I'm loud. But in any event, are there any questions from the audience? Okay, front row. So just wait for the lovely attendant who's going to risk her life walking at a quick pace down the stairs. So the online audience can hear. Yes, thank you.
I was curious from the first talk about the flags and the governments involved with Spain being pushed out and such. Was there a role of the church as well, since we also had the role of Catholic versus Protestant in conflict, shall we say, in that area and at that time?
Yes, so precisely. Part of what instigated the revolt was this deep schism between the Catholic Church and the Protestant, caused during the Protestant Reformation. So the revolt begins exactly at the time when Protestants are entering Catholic churches and destroying images, really saying this is not what we believe, this is not appropriate to our practice of our religion. So the confrontation with Spain is partly a way to assert the kind of the rise of Protestantism and the rejection of Catholicism as the dominant power. So it is, implicit in that conflict. That's not the only reason that that the revolt occurs, but it is a huge part of it.
Okay, there's a question from online, and since the image is on the screen, this anonymous person would like to know if you know what species that bird is, and whether it's a comment on the season. Sorry, I don't know.
Can you hear?
Yeah.
That is an excellent question. I am not so sure. But I will say this, you know that it's got an extremely long tail. You sort of know how there are those little birds that when you go to the beach, not seagulls, they're tiny, they have little spindly legs, and they kind of are digging for worms in the mud. Those are very, like, they know this is like prime pickings. I think that, you know, it could be something like that. To me, I read this as like showing more a time of day, but I think that's a really good point. There could be more specific information to get from that bird about season. That's true, yeah.
Any Dutch people out there know what kind of bird that is? No? Okay. It's a kiefit. Okay, see? We need you.
I know, I'm gonna look this up.
Thank you. Any other questions from the audience? Oh, okay. Hold on. This is so everyone online can hear you.
I'm sorry, it's a little bit of a technical question. I grew up there, as you can imagine, as you probably might guess, and to me, it was always amazing when I see those paintings about all that skating and those ice tableaus. How in the hell did they paint? For real? Were they there? Wasn't it impossible to paint outside in the cold? Or was this all done later on? He just made sketches, and then he memorized them, I guess, and then put them back on painting on the oil?
Yeah, so you're absolutely right. They did not do that outside.
No.
I mean, the paint would have not been.
Also, you couldn't move your hands.
Yeah,
I
your
couldn't.
hand. So if you go to the exhibition, you'll see a lot of little drawings on a back wall, the one of the peat digger in particular. And there's some that are in graphite as well. So quick sketches could be done in a sketchbook, and then they would go back to the studio and make these paintings inside.
One other question, but it's.
Well, go ahead.
So I mean, I know what Holland looked like in the old days, and right now there's not much ocean or lakes left to really pump empty and make into land. But at the same time, the land is sinking. I wonder what the heck is going to happen to all those dikes that are going to be too low as the sea level is rising.
Okay, Alex, you're our resident engineer. Do you have an opinion about this?
For the record, I am not an engineer. I am an art historian. I'm sorry to say, but so the question was, what's going to happen, basically?
Water level.
Is the country going to disappear again?
Probably.
Presumably, the Dutch have been good at water management for centuries, right? So, in theory, the Dutch should be quite useful to us as more parts of the world are finding themselves underwater, right? So, I think we're actually going to learn a lot from the histories of Dutch water management.
Yeah, it's certainly true that after Katrina, for instance, the Dutch went in to sort of save the day with their engineering expertise. And then just in terms of in the Netherlands, there's something called the Delta Works, which is it's enormous. And it was, I think, launched after this catastrophic flood in the 50s, I want to say.
In Zeeland, yeah.
Yeah. So, you look up pictures of it, it's a huge, like, countrywide system, basically, to keep the North Sea out, more or less. So, there have been some amazing initiatives, certainly, but, I mean, Lord knows what's going to happen, in the future. I am not a prophet.
And I would.
Okay,
You
so
don't
a
have to.
question.
Oh, sorry, can I just?
Oh, yeah,
Just
sorry.
add something really quick, which is, I mean, there is also a school of thought which is learning to live with what's going to happen, right? And maybe not repeating some of the socioeconomic divisions, right, in the past, or I think Katrina is a good example of how we can think about living with wetlands, but not using them to reinforce systemic discriminatory policies, right? Like, so what about living with it? It is. I don't know. Can you hear me or not? But,
Yeah.
Okay. Sorry.
Up there?
Thank you. So what I understood from the last bit of the presentation is when you went back, let's say 20,000 years back, is that there was land degradation that was human caused by the use of the peat moss, the resource? Is that what was implied?
Yeah, so peat is basically it's like before it eventually over time becomes what we think of as coal, but it's like organic matter that settles at the bottom of a peat bog. And 10,000 years ago, when ice caps receded, they kind of tore up the land, and what was left were sort of these impressions in which stagnant water sat. And in that stagnant water was like sometimes animal bodies, but largely vegetal matter. And what people would do, what they figured out, is you could dig this peat out, or you could, sometimes the peat was a little bit more at surface level, but you cut it out and you let it dry. The more that people exhumed this peat, the more that the land started to kind of sink in on itself. Or when you left a shallow depression at the surface of the earth, it quickly fills up with water, so you end up getting these very dangerous lakes in which people drowned, right? This happens in the Haarlemmermeer. And that's also why land elevation falls. Fossil fuels, starting at the end of the 17th century, the Dutch start to use a lot more coal coming from England, for example. So fossil fuels eventually supplant this system, but the Dutch, because they had kind of, and they aren't alone in this, had taken down a lot of the timber in their nation or in that territory, had to turn to this resource, which they happened to have a lot of. And this was also, by the time you get to the 17th century, so important for their economic prowess. They were a very powerful nation because they could, within their own borders, provide the energy sources necessary to run their industries to great effect. So the end result is that the land did suffer. It sinks, and the terrain kind of falls, continues to sink in on itself because the peat's not there to kind of keep the land up, and then water management becomes even more and more important. It's just this like cycle. And some scientists think, when we think about the Anthropocene, so sort of the word we use to declare when human behaviors have actively started changing the weather pattern. Some people say that this is kind of actually, it starts in the 17th century when there's a large exhumation of natural resources, like digging peat out of bogs.
Okay, I see another question there in the center.
Thank you. Can you please comment on the technique of drawing? There seem to be, the drawings appear to be very small and very, very detailed. How did this artist perform and create these pieces of art? For example, did he use a magnifying glass to draw? Would you comment on his instruments of application of I think it was their ink, as I think they are? How did he do it?
So I'll take that. So they are small because they're drawn on hand, made paper. So nothing is bought commercially or made. They're made by hand. They're, the average drawings that we're looking at are like this size. So what you're seeing way back there on a screen that's enlarging them way beyond the artist ever imagined you to look at them in that way are details that he's sort of keeping in the distance or not bringing out to the attention that we have today using modern technology. But he's using a quill for to use dip in ink that's probably Bister based or iron gall ink, and then watercolor he's applying and letting it rest. So these are standard materials that artists used to draw with in the 17th century, and not just in the Netherlands, but all over. They're all naturally occurring materials. but to use it, they're not using a magnifying glass to draw. They're doing, they're sitting with their sharpened quill and their, pointed brush to make these very delicate, detailed. I mean, the detail is definitely Dutch, but that level of detail that you're seeing that seems you could only see with a magnifying glass, yeah, the artists were never intending you to see them on that level of detail. I mean, that blown up, so to speak. But the Averkamp was, like many other great Dutch artists, just he was probably had training. We don't know who he trained with per se, but he spent a lot of time doing these meticulous, detailed drawings on these very small pieces of paper. And the paintings even aren't that big. And we should say, one of the questions is like, who was buying these, and were rich people buying depictions of poor people? And yes, they were. And they were, the drawings were not hung and displayed the way the paintings were. They were kept in albums, and they would be brought out with a small group of friends and looked at together in a very limited number, but intimate, in an intimate way. Another question. You guys are doing all the work for me. I have questions too, but.
Hi. Water management is a huge issue in California. If we just think about the reemergence of the great inland lake about 2 seasons ago, yes, in the Central Valley. And I was wondering if the speakers looking at this with what they study, they either see or envision an emergence of painting, drawing, etching tradition within the state related to what's happening with our water in California. Sometimes there's none. Sometimes it comes out of nowhere and becomes a great lake. Do you envision this coming to exist? Someday people will say, look at these drawings and paintings of California and its water and what was happening. Here are paintings of the Delta. Here's the great inland lake. Sometimes it's here, sometimes it's not. Do you see a tradition might emerge? Do you see any evidence of this sort of thing now? And even if you don't, do you envision this as a possibility?
I think that's a great idea, and artists should go check out Tulare Lake. I know I was very, very curious about the reemergence, especially after all of this work to basically suppress it, and I guess basically divert all the water for our agriculture or for Los Angeles. Yeah, so I mean, I hope artists are kind of, taking advantage of that opportunity to go out and, kind of address this from an eco-critical perspective. But that's my 2 cents.
Yeah, I think you'll find that contemporary artists are very concerned about the climate crisis and address it directly as an explicit subject matter. But I think what's so interesting from the perspective of this panel is to really ask, to what extent is awareness on the part of the artist necessary in order for these stories to be embedded into the visual culture that they produce? Because, in our modern sense of the word, Averkamp was not a climate activist of any sort, but nevertheless, his paintings and drawings and watercolors preserve conditions of this extreme climate that today we can recognize as bearing witness to what was happening, even if he wasn't necessarily advocating for one particular position on it or not. But nevertheless, we can actually excavate that with the kind of hindsight of history and with the particular concern that we are experiencing today as not only as historians, but as citizens of the world. So I can absolutely see a version of 200, 400 years from now, art historians looking at art produced today, even if it's not explicitly about climate change, but seeing traces of the climate crisis therein.
And I should say that was one of the things working on this exhibition, I was, kept looking at these enchanting drawings that everyone says, oh, it's just about everyone having fun on the ice. But there's always someone getting hurt. There's always someone falling down. There's always, in this sense of movement from one place to another, some boat that's frozen and can't move, some fishing hole that's way too large for just catching fish. And there's always a sense of, danger evident in these charming scenes. And this notion and this focus on adaptation and resilience despite these dangers is, I think, something that we're really now, for the first time, looking at these compositions. That's mostly because of the current climate crisis that we find ourselves in. I think, as things change, we look back at the past and find things that were probably always there, but we just never thought they were important then. So if anything, this exhibition is trying to get people, and these young scholars' work is trying to get people to look at what has, paintings that have been around for hundreds of years, but some things get accentuated to talk about where others don't. And that's why, I wanted to ask as a final, if that's okay, the question to these three panelists. They're finishing or recently finished their dissertations. They've come up with these really interesting, new, innovative ways to look at 17th century Dutch paintings or drawings. How did you find yourself on that particular journey, which was one that was very different than the journey that I was on 20 years ago?
I can go ahead and start. So I came to this particular topic about the flags in Averkamp's paintings, partly just out of sheer curiosity based on noticing the flag pop up over and over and over again, and thinking about this critical moment for the Dutch Republic of fighting for sovereignty. The 12 Years' Truce is an interesting period because nothing has been guaranteed, and in fact, the war with Spain doesn't end until 1648, more than 20 years after the end of the truce. And so I was sort of fascinated with why someone would insist on showing a flag for a nation that hasn't fully gained its sovereignty. I thought that was really curious. And at the same time, I was interested in this phenomenon of immigration, these migrants moving out of Catholic, Spanish-controlled regions of the Low Countries into these provinces that offered some kind of promise of freedom and religious tolerance and a kind of new prosperity. And I think partly that was motivated by my own experience of being an immigrant. I came to the United States as a child, but to think about how a new flag, what a new flag might mean for people entering a nation that's sort of in the works. So it was both a combination of noticing a quirky detail that I thought, is this an accident, or is this kind of a cute, literal color added to these compositions, or is it really something much more meaningful that we haven't really taken seriously, particularly in light of Averkamp being cast as this sort of observer, but not a kind of critical thinker. So that's how I came to this particular topic.
Well, in my case, I'm still writing my dissertation, but I came to my topic because, as any other sort of Northern art scholars in the room or on Zoom know, every single book or exhibition catalog about landscape painting or drawings or prints in the 17th century Netherlands, they all say, oh, and by the way, they were making these landscape images, and there was also land reclamation going on. And then they kind of just move merrily along back to the drawings, which isn't a criticism or anything, it's just something I observed. And so I thought that there was an opportunity there, basically, to contribute new research and to kind of think a little bit more broadly about different kinds of people being creative in ways that weren't strictly artistic, and to try to bring that into the conversation. So,
well, some years ago, you may recall in the news cycle, the phrase "drain the swamp" was being batted about a lot, and I was sitting. I am from the state of Georgia, where there are a lot of swamps, and I thought, what not so bad about a swamp anyway. And I had also been interested in Dutch landscape for quite some time, and I just kind of had a moment where it all crystallized for me that, in fact, people don't really talk so much about the water that you see in Dutch landscapes, that actually when you step back and look at it, it's everywhere. And the usual narrative, or one usual narrative you see in the literature is that, and this is quoted in your fabulous exhibition text, well, God created earth, but the Dutch created Holland. It was the draining of the water. That's what made us so glorious. And I feel that that is certainly a legitimate claim, but in fact, artists never stop depicting the wetlands. It's always there. So I think that there's something much more important also going on there, that in fact, it was sometimes in the preservation, even if only in artistic works of wetlands, that in fact equally important cultural things happened, equally important people lived and thrived. And the long tail end of this is how, 400 years later, you hear a phrase like drain the swamp. In fact, when landscape kind of visually as we know it began with the Dutch, there is a chain there, right? There's an intellectual chain. And so, how did we get from these beautiful images, which wetlands are so prominent, to this current state of affairs, where also in the midst of climate change, marsh migration is being spoke of as a threat, a bad thing, right? So a lot of this work is driven by actually just look at the beauty and the culture that is actually there, and kind of following the chain to where we are now. How did we get here?
Well, thank you all for coming, and please see the exhibition if you haven't seen it, or enjoy the rest of the day here at the Getty.